Welcome to Unit 2 of World History, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars. The key question for this whole unit is going to be, why do historians argue that the French Revolution became the modern for modern revolutions and nationalism? And you're going to explore that through basically comparing this revolution to two others, the American and the Haitian revolutions, as part of your summative assessment. This is a painting that's pretty iconic about the kind of first phase of the French Revolution. It's called The Storming of the Palace of the Tuileries, and you can see you've got the French tricolor, kind of a different version of the modern flag in the middle. You've got barricades made by local citizens in the city. You can also tell that this is in the 1790s. They're fighting with swords. It's the same time period really as the American Revolution, with all of the kind of technology that means. And you've got the nobility and the army fighting against the citizenry and losing. So that's kind of the classic revolutionary image. The citizens uprise, you've got the city on fire, they storm the palace, they're literally storming a palace, and they overthrow the monarchy, the nobility, the oppressor. So this section is about the beginning of the French Revolution and what caused it and why did it change course after its early years. So that's going to be the focus question you're going to have to answer for section 1 of this chapter 18. So one of the questions and kind of the starts of the French Revolution is at the calling of something called the Estates General. And so basically, before we get into why the Estates General was called, this is an image of it. You can see through kind of the outfits folks are wearing. Like some of these guys look like they're wearing like black judge robes. Over here on the right, you've got, aristocratic dress. This is not a parliament like we were talking about in England in the last unit. This is more of a vestige of the feudal ages. The three estates in France are the first, second, and third estate. The first estate is the clergy, who actually have political power in France before the French Revolution, and who are also really importantly exempt from taxes. The second estate's the nobility. They also don't pay taxes. There's about twice as many nobility as there are members of the clergy. And then the third estate are the 90% remainder of the 27 million people of France, and they have different sort of political positions and different sort of economic status depending on how wealthy they are, frankly. There are some priests in the first estate who are poor and kind of are from the countryside, and they end up siding with the third estate, which will become important as this, estates general begins to meet. So just to kind of continue on the divisions between the clergy and nobility and the third estate itself is also broken up into smaller pieces. And so the kind of most important for our purposes and the leaders of the French Revolution is the bourgeoisie, who are effectively the educated professional classes. They're not nobility, but they're doctors, they're lawyers, people that have, frankly enough, money and free time to get involved in organizing the revolution. The remainder of the third estate is the peasantry, and this is 80% of the population, and they're really suffering the most, but they don't have as much ability to be active in the early part of the revolution. So King Louis calls this Estates General basically, which is a meeting of all three of these estates. So it's this, in that room we saw in the first image, representatives of the first, second, and third estate are called by King Louis to raise taxes. He had to raise taxes because there was basically 2 years of really terrible harvests. There was a perception by the French public, not just the third estate, that the royal court at Versailles, if you remember back to the Hall of Mirrors and the gold on the walls, was living in luxury while everyone else was starving. This painting, if you look at it quickly, looks like it's just a wheat harvest, but it's actually titled The Gleaners. And so this is painted about the basically food crisis. And these women are actually picking up the remaining grains of wheat off the ground that the harvest left behind because they're so desperate to survive. And so, the French people are desperate to survive. The king is living in luxury. And then this Estates General was asked to raise money. And instead of kind of just listening to what he asked them to do, they have some other ideas. So on May 5th, 1789, that's the first meeting of the Estates General. And it quickly moves from taxes to government reform. One of the problems that the third estate, which if you remember again is 80% of the people had, is that each estate got one vote. So the 2% of the population that is, our clergy in the Roman Catholic Church had as much voting power in this assembly, or I'm sorry, this States General, as did the 80% of the population represented by the third estate. So the third estate quit. They lasted about a month, and then they go and they start meeting and calling themselves the National Assembly, saying they truly represent the people of France. They find themselves locked out of their meeting room and go to this local tennis court and swear an oath that becomes famous as the tennis court oath to keep fighting until France has a constitution and is no longer an absolute monarchy. The people of Paris hear about this, and they hear that the king, who is going to send an army after the National Assembly, the Third Estate, and they storm the Bastille and basically seize all the weapons of King Louis's military before he can send his army to go crush the National Assembly. So basically, the city of Paris is now free of the monarchy. King Louis is out in Versailles, out in the countryside, but where power is, where the money is, where all the apparatus of government are, you have effectively a more democratic government in control of France. And this is a painting of the tennis court oath, obviously very fanciful. So the National Assembly basically gets the help of the folks in Paris to kick out the king, kick out the agents of the king, and they start to make reforms. So in the countryside, the knowledge that the National Assembly has won and stormed the Bastille reaches the peasants, and they revolt against their local landlords. They lock up nobility in various castles. There's burning of tax collectors' houses, and the National Assembly, in response to this, and also because of their own agenda, abolishes all the privileges of the nobility with this document called Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And so this is effectively a kind of updated version of the American Bill of Rights, because some of the folks that worked on it, including Thomas Jefferson, went and was in Paris at the time and helped write a version that basically extends the same ideas as in the American Bill of Rights and the English Bill of Rights before that. This document is not misnamed when they're saying rights of man in it. They explicitly excluded women, and leading thinkers like Olympia de Gouges basically embarrass the National Assembly and the French press, but they don't change, and women are still excluded from having rights under this new French document of freedom. Interestingly, when King Louis fails to accept this Declaration of Rights, because he's still the official head of the government, a mob of about 2,000 Parisian women storm the palace at Versailles and basically accuse him of causing their children to starve and threaten him to burn down the palace unless he accepts the abolition of the rights of the nobility and signs the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Louis is brought back in a cart. You can see this cartoon right here illustrating it. And he, in his entourage, basically throw bags of flour at the crowd to keep them from tearing him apart. And these women march him back with a cannon in his back into the city of Paris, and he's effectively placed under house arrest, meaning, he's no longer really a king, an absolute monarch. He's more of a prisoner of the state. The assembly responds to these women's action by making the king a limited monarch, who effectively is a figurehead, and they also strip the land from the Catholic Church and effectively destroy that First Estate's political power and rename themselves the Legislative Assembly. Neighbors in Europe who have absolute monarchs are really threatened by this, and so they get these nasty letters effectively from Austria and Prussia to France to restore the monarchy, and the Legislative Assembly declares war on these countries first. It goes really badly, and this ends up resulting in a further economic slump. So you have bad harvests right before the French Revolution begins, and then you have the French revolutionaries declare war on these absolute monarchs and fail. And you get, kind of surprisingly in some degree, a more radical group of revolutionaries take over. And they effectively imprison the old National Assembly and the king into an even deeper sort of house arrest. These folks are called the sans-culottes, and you can kind of see it's basically it means without breeches. And it effectively means that these are meant to be more working class folks, although many of them actually have as much wealth as the members of the Third Estate. They suspend the monarchy until a new national convention is elected. that has no property qualifications. So the biggest distinction between these new sans-culottes and the Paris Commune that they established in the National Assembly is the sans-culottes did not believe in property qualifications for voting. And so when they take over, it's seen as kind of the end of the beginning of the French Revolution, which is going to go on for a good deal of time after this. But this is kind of the end of the first kind of early phase of it.